album.
Oh,
So
wow.
we divided, there's 6 albums
Yeah.
that we did, so each one in order. And it was really fun because a lot of the
At 79, Robby Krieger has lived the kind of musical life most artists can only dream of. As the quiet, introspective guitarist of The Doors, he helped shape songs that became of rock history, yet he was never the loudest voice in the room. Krieger has always preferred to let the music speak for him. But with age comes reflection, and recently he began opening up more than ever about the music that shaped him. The albums that guided his hands across the fretboard, and the records that left fingerprints on his soul. These weren't just background sounds. They were roadmaps, each one arriving at the right moment in his life. Some were albums he discovered as a teenager, just beginning to understand the power of improvisation. Others came later when fame had already wrapped itself around him and he was searching for new meaning and sound. Jazz records that stretched boundaries, blues albums that hurt in all the right places, and rock releases that reminded him why he fell in love with the guitar in the first place. In looking back, Krieger wasn't chasing nostalgia. He was acknowledging the lineage of inspiration, the artists who unknowingly helped him become who he is. As he reflected on these albums, it became clear that this wasn't just a list. It was a portrait of an artist's inner world, revealed one record at a time. When Robby Krieger talks about the music that shaped him, he doesn't speak like someone trying to rank records or impress critics. He speaks like a musician remembering discoveries. Long before The Doors filled arenas, Krieger was a teenager sitting near a record player, fascinated by sounds that didn't follow predictable rules. One of the first worlds that truly opened his imagination was flamenco. He has often said that flamenco guitar taught him how emotion can live inside a single note, how a melody can rise and fall like a human voice. From there, jazz arrived, not in small steps but like a flood. Hearing players improvise freely gave him permission to do the same. Albums by boundary-pushing musicians didn't simply entertain him. They suggested that music could be a conversation rather than a script, and that idea never left him. As Krieger grew older, blues crept in as a teacher of feeling more than complexity. He heard albums where notes bent and lingered, where pain, humor, and resilience mixed together inside the guitar tone itself. The blues showed him restraint, the beauty of saying more with less. And when he later crafted guitar lines for The Doors, that influence was there. Those long, haunting bends and subtle slides were not accidents. They were echoes of nights spent absorbing records that seemed to bleed emotion out of every bar. He was never the kind of guitarist obsessed with speed. He chased mood, color, and atmosphere, and the albums he loved reinforced that direction. Rock records of the 60s carried another type of energy into his life. They were bold, youthful, and experimental. Krieger experienced them not from the lens of a superstar, but as a musician standing inside the very wave that was forming. He heard artists refusing to repeat the past and realized he could do the same. Those albums showed him there was room for poetry, darkness, spirituality, and rebellion inside popular music. The idea that songs could be both catchy and philosophically charged resonated deeply with him, and later aligned perfectly with the lyrical world Jim Morrison inhabited. Jazz improvisers continued to be guiding lights. Albums filled with long solos, unexpected chord changes, and fearless experimentation showed Krieger how far a melody could travel if you trusted it. He appreciated players who stepped into the unknown every time they performed, never giving the same solo twice. That attitude became a defining trait of his own playing on stage. Doors concerts were never mechanical reproductions of studio tracks. They were living events, influenced by the same improvisational spirit he first encountered on those treasured records spinning on his turntable. There were also quieter albums that impacted him just as deeply. Acoustic records, reflective singer-songwriter projects, and instrumentals built around space instead of volume reminded him that silence is of music too. They helped shape his sensitivity to dynamics. Listening carefully to those albums taught him that a whisper can sometimes hit harder than a shout. You can hear that lesson inside many Doors songs where the guitar hangs back, then appears suddenly and powerfully. Not as constant noise, but as a strategic voice. What's striking when Krieger looks back is that his favorite albums are not confined to one genre. Nor do they follow a straight chronological progression. They form a map of curiosity. They trace a young man searching for new sounds, a rising star absorbing the work of his peers, and an older artist returning to records that now carry layers of memory. Some of those albums brought technical lessons. Others simply made him feel less alone. Together they shaped the warm, unmistakable slide tone, the lyrical phrasing, and the understated confidence for which he is known. In reflecting on these albums at 79, Krieger isn't just reminiscing. He is acknowledging that no musician creates in isolation. Every solo is of a long conversation stretching across decades and genres. Those records were companions during long practice sessions, sources of comfort on the road, and sparks of inspiration in the studio. They guided him as he helped craft one of the most distinctive bodies of work in rock history. And as he shares them now, they also become invitations for new listeners to trace the same path. Drop a needle on a favorite record and feel that familiar moment when music suddenly changes the direction of a life. As Robby Krieger moved from being an inspired young listener to a working professional musician, the albums that mattered to him began to take on different meanings. Records were no longer just lessons. They became mirrors. During the height of the Doors' success, the pressure of touring, recording, and public attention could easily have swallowed him whole. At those times, he returned to albums that reminded him why he played music in the first place. Some of them were albums he had loved long before fame, and revisiting them felt like visiting old friends. Others were new discoveries that proved music was still evolving around him, still capable of surprising him, still capable of delivering that first spark. Feeling he remembered from being a kid with a guitar and a stack of vinyl. Krieger has often been described as the calm center inside the storms that surrounded the Doors. His musical taste reflected that calm. He gravitated toward albums with depth rather than noise, albums where emotion accumulated slowly rather than exploding all at once. Jazz records with long instrumental passages gave him mental space in an era when everything else around him seemed condensed and accelerated. In those recordings, he heard players listening to each other as much as they played, leaving room, trading ideas, trusting silence. That approach would become of his own instincts on stage, letting music breathe instead of filling every second with sound. The albums that influenced him during those years were also connected to exploration. Psychedelic, blues rock, avant-garde jazz, and world music-infused projects widened his concept of what a guitar could be. These were albums that didn't treat genre boundaries as walls but as doors, and it is impossible to miss the poetic accuracy of that metaphor in his life. As he absorbed those records, he realized that a guitar didn't need to shout to be powerful. It could suggest, question, haunt, and comfort. The sounds he heard on those albums encouraged him to experiment with tone, alternate styles, bottleneck slide, and melodies that didn't behave the way textbook phrases were supposed to behave. There were also albums linked directly to memory, and those may be the most powerful of all. Music has a way of attaching itself to specific times in life, and for Krieger, some records are permanently tied to long nights on the road, studio sessions that stretch till dawn, or quiet afternoons between tours. When he listens back to them now, he doesn't simply hear musicians performing. He hears versions of himself at different ages, different crossroads. Those albums hold personal history in the same way old photographs do, except that music breathes and moves and changes slightly each time it is played. With age came gratitude. When Krieger reflects on albums that shaped him, there is no competition in his tone. No concern about rankings or lists in the conventional sense. Instead, there is appreciation for the way other artists' work opened doors in his imagination. Some of the musicians behind those albums became friends. Some he never met. Yet they all feel connected through sound. That sense of connection is something Krieger has spoken about in his own career. The idea that music forms communities that do not require physical presence or spoken conversation. Listening becomes its own form of dialogue. In many ways. The albums that remain most important to him today are not simply the flashiest or most historically famous ones, but rather those that changed his thinking even slightly. They altered the way he viewed harmony, phrasing, or the role of the guitar in a song. They encouraged him to trust his instincts even when they led him away from convention. When he was younger, those records felt like teachers. Now they feel like companions that walked beside him across decades of creation, loss, growth, and reflection. As he looks back at 79, the idea of choosing 10 favorites is less about narrowing down history and more about honoring certain milestones of influence. The albums he highlights point to moments where something clicked inside him, where he heard a sound and thought, without fully understanding why, that everything would be different from that point on. Those turning points are not visible to the outside world, but they live in the music he went on to create. Every sustained note, every unexpected chord movement, every moody guitar figure carries traces of those earlier discoveries. In that sense, his favorite albums are not just records he admired. They are foundations that still echo through every stage he walks onto today. By the time Robby Krieger reached the later chapters of his career, his relationship with music had changed again. In his youth, albums were maps pointing toward the future. In his middle years, they were companions, grounding him during the chaos of fame. Now, with decades of experience behind him, they have become reflections. Listening is no longer about preparing for the next stage or the next recording session. It is about understanding the full arc of a musical life. When he revisits the albums that mattered most, he doesn't just hear other artists anymore. He hears the way those artists shaped his own choices, his instincts, and even his sense of self. There is a certain clarity that comes only with age. Krieger has the ability now to look back without the urgency of youth or the pressure of the spotlight. He can see how jazz, blues, classical, rock, and world music intersected in unexpected ways within his playing. The albums that influenced him were not isolated landmarks. They were threads woven together into one voice that became unmistakably his. He never set out to sound like anyone else, yet all of those records live quietly underneath the music he created. Like roots under a tree that no one sees but everyone depends on. One of the striking things about Krieger's perspective is how little ego dominates it. Many musicians of his stature become preoccupied with legacy, with ranking themselves or others. He talks instead about curiosity. The albums that still move him are those that feel alive, records where you sense the musicians taking risks in real time. He has always responded to honesty in music more than perfection. Imperfections, the small human touches, the breath before a difficult phrase, the slight hesitation in tempo, are the very things that give life to many of the albums he treasures. They remind him that music is made by people, not machines, and that its power lies precisely in that humanity. As someone who has spent a lifetime performing, Krieger also hears albums differently from casual listeners. He listens not only as a fan but as someone who understands the invisible decisions inside every song. He recognizes when an artist chose restraint instead of excess, when a guitarist held back a solo for emotional impact, or when a band trusted silence to say as much as sound. Those choices resonate with him because he wrestled with similar decisions throughout his own career. In that sense, his favorite albums function almost like private conversations among musicians across time, each one acknowledging the other's struggles and triumphs. There is also the reality of loss that accompanies listening later in life. Many of the artists behind the albums he loves are gone. Some were contemporaries. Others were heroes from an earlier generation. When Krieger hears their recordings now, there is admiration, but there is also a gentle sadness. Music can freeze time, but life cannot. Those records become reminders not only of inspiration, but of the fragility of creative lives. Yet, instead of making him retreat, that awareness has deepened his gratitude. The albums endure. The performances remain. The conversations through sound continue even when the players themselves are no longer here. Another dimension that shapes his choices is growth beyond genre identity. Krieger has long moved past the need to separate styles into neat boxes. The albums he values most do not belong to a single category. They simply strike him as true. Some are quiet, others intense. Some are technically complex, others beautifully simple. What unites them is sincerity. He can feel when an artist was chasing something real, whether that was spiritual depth, emotional honesty, or sonic exploration. Those pursuits mirror his own lifelong curiosity. And perhaps that is why those albums have stayed with him for so long. Listening for Krieger now is also a form of teaching. Not only for himself, but for younger musicians. When he names the albums that shaped him, he is not boasting about taste. He is pointing a path, saying in effect, "These open doors for me. They may open something for you too." Music has always worked this way, through influence quietly passed down rather than formally assigned. By speaking openly about his favorites, he becomes of that chain, just as those earlier artists unknowingly guided him. In the end, the 10 albums he highlights at 79 are less about narrowing down a canon and more about telling a story. They trace the evolution of a curious kid into a seasoned artist who understands both the magic and the work behind the notes. They reveal that inspiration is not a single event, but a lifetime of listening, absorbing, questioning, and responding. Each album represents a moment when something inside him shifted, when a new door opened, when music once again proved that it still had more to teach him. And even now, as he reflects on those milestones, there is the quiet suggestion that he is still listening, still learning, still finding new records that surprise him and remind him why he fell in love with music in the first place. As Robby Krieger reflects on his life in music, the idea of choosing 10 favorite albums becomes less about narrowing taste and more about recognition. At 79, he understands that music is not just something you listen to. It is something that accompanies you. The albums he speaks about now are woven through friendships, miles on the road, creative breakthroughs, and periods of doubt. They are reminders of the moments when music stepped in and said exactly what words could not. When he talks about the records that mean the most, his tone is not that of a critic compiling a list. It is the voice of someone acknowledging the role music has played in helping him navigate an extraordinary life. Krieger has always been known as the quiet member of the Doors, someone who let his instrument speak in colors and atmospheres instead of long speeches. That quietness is present in the way he discusses his favorite albums as well. There is no need for exaggeration or shock value. What matters to him is sincerity. Some albums became favorites not because they were the most famous or critically celebrated, but because they struck him at exactly the right time. A melody during a lonely tour, a lyric that suddenly made sense years after first hearing it, a guitar tone that opened a new direction in his own. These are the kinds of experiences that etched certain records permanently into his memory. There is also the realization that the albums we love change meaning as we change. Records he heard as a teenager now sound different through the lens of age. The same songs carry new emotional shades, just as familiar photographs reveal new details the longer you look at them. Krieger recognizes this shifting relationship. An album that once represented rebellion might now represent resilience. A record that once sounded mysterious might now feel comforting. The music has not changed, but the listener has. And he accepts that as of the beauty of the art form. When Krieger names his favorite albums today, he's also, in a way, thanking them. He credits them not only with inspiring riffs or influencing style, but with sustaining him. The life of a musician is not merely applause and spotlight. It is long rehearsals, uncertainty, pressure, and the strange sense of living public and private lives simultaneously. Throughout all of it, those albums were constant companions. They sat beside him on tour buses and hotel rooms. They filled quiet hours between shows. They were there in times when fame felt heavy and in times when gratitude felt light. Music both gave him a career and helped him carry the weight of having one. Another notable aspect of Krieger's reflections is how strongly he believes that discovery never ends. Even at 79, he talks about listening forward as much as listening back. His list of meaningful albums is open-ended. He does not treat it as a sealed capsule from the past, but as something still capable of growing. New artists, new sounds, and unexpected musical directions continue to capture his attention. That openness is perhaps the clearest reason he has remained creatively alive for so long. He has never believed that inspiration belongs only to youth. The albums that shaped him also connect him to listeners. Fans who grew up with the Doors often return to the same records he once loved, finding in them their own emotional maps. In sharing the music that influenced him, Krieger is also inviting people into the process behind songs they already know. They can listen to those earlier albums and hear faintly the strands that later wove into Light My Fire, Riders on the Storm, or the countless improvisations that became of Doors' live history. The chain of influence becomes visible, not as imitation, but as conversation across generations. As he speaks about these albums at 79, Krieger does not claim certainty or finality. Instead, there is humility. He sees himself as one musician among many, shaped by those who came before and hopefully offering something to those who will come after.